Hello, global gardeners, and happy Monday. It's such a wonderful time of year. It's frigid for some of us still, but we're thinking about the plants that we're going to grow. And maybe some of you have already started your seeds for the plants that are going to be in your garden this year. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about those seeds and what you need to do to get them germinated. Today is the next stop in the process. You've got the seeds that have germinated, and now you've got seedlings. What do you need to do to keep those seedlings alive to the point that you could put them in pots or put them in your garden and start growing them? That's the whole point of the seeds in the first place, right? Remember those key factors we talked about before. All a seed needs to germinate is an appropriate temperature, oxygen, and moisture. It's as simple as that. For a seedling to grow, there's a couple more factors that are critical, and that's light and nutrients. So the seed has everything it needs to begin the growth cycle. All the energy that the seed needs is contained within that small shell. When it germinates, it'll take the energy from the seed and the seedling will begin growing. And actually, those first leaves that appear on that seedling, the energy to produce those leaves comes from the seed. Even those big seedlings, the pea seedlings and the bean seedlings, pretty big plants, all that energy came from the seed. But for the next phase, those other leaves and the growth of the stem beyond that initial point, that has to come from the roots and the growing medium that you're using and the nutrients contained within that material. So that's where we'll start today. I'd like to say it's great to have Jay back today. It's always nice to see you here. And of course, along with Heidi, our fantastic moderators that keep everything flowing, and everybody else that's checking in from all over the world. It's so fantastic to see you. Sherry says it all. And this is a big reason why I grow my own seeds. I love bean seedlings, she says. They look so exuberant. And that's one of the best things about growing the seeds. So we select our seeds, we give them the warmth and the oxygen and the moisture, and then they start sprouting. And when they start growing, there's just few things that are that wondrous. And yes, they look exuberant. I get exuberant at times when I'm seeing my little seedlings emerge and begin growing. But like many gardeners, if you've done this long enough, you're going to have issues. Some of those seedlings that look so wonderful end up dying and you don't know what went wrong. Well, often it can be traced back to those basic factors. So the seed needs an appropriate temperature to germinate. The plant needs an appropriate temperature to grow. Luckily, most of the seedlings that we're going to be growing do pretty well at the temperatures that are within our houses. So if your house is anywhere close to 68 or 70 degrees Fahrenheit, about 21 Celsius, that's perfect for almost all plants, even those seeds that need additional heat. So we talked previously about chili pepper seeds, for instance, that will benefit from a heat mat, from increased warmth. It needs that to germinate most effectively. But once the plant is growing, you can actually turn off the heat mat or remove it completely because the plant doesn't need that much heat. Room temperature is fine. And this is the first issue that I want to point out. I've killed a lot of plants because I left the heat mat on. I let the temperature in the soil get warm for germination and then stay warm. Normally, it's not a huge issue, but what happens when you're growing your own seedlings under lights that you have and on top of a heat mat is that the soil tends to dry out faster when it's warm. And so I have to water pretty much every day my seedlings to keep the moisture levels consistent. In the past, more than once, you'd think that I would have learned after the first time, but the heat mat causes the soil to dry out. And without that moist soil, the roots will die. And if the roots die, that seedling dies. So there's been a few times where I didn't water on a particular day and I came back the next day and my seedlings had already died. In a single day without that moisture, that was enough. So remember, we still need to give the plants that oxygen and that moisture and that appropriate temperature to keep them surviving past the germination phase. The light is going to provide the photosynthesis that is necessary for the plant to survive. And so the photosynthesis is going to create all that energy that the plant's going to use, all those sugars and the starches that generate the growth. That all comes from the light. As the plant grows, the process also requires other nutrients. Now, you know the big three: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. There are other nutrients, macronutrients and micronutrients, that the seedlings can benefit from, but they don't necessarily need in large quantities. So in a little bit, I'll be talking more about fertilizing the seedlings and what you need to think about from that perspective. But the key during the entire time is the moisture of your growing medium. I like to use my own mixes. I've talked about this before. My mixes primarily use peat moss or cocoa coir as the base. That is in the largest quantities. Both of those materials will retain moisture. And so that's why potting mixes have that as part of the potting mix. Because when you water, you want the moisture in the soil to stay relatively consistent. Another big reason that people tend to kill their plants is the inconsistent moisture. First, like I just talked about, it dries out and kills the plant. When you think your soil is too dry, what's going to be your natural response? You're going to water it, right? That is probably the most likely reason that gardeners kill their young seedlings, is they overwater. We want to baby those little plants. We want to keep those plants happy. We know they need water. We know that Gardener Scott has killed plants because he let the soil dry out. So we want to water and water and water. When you saturate the soil, when there's too much water, a few things can happen. First off, you can actually choke off that oxygen. So there needs to be some space within that growing medium for oxygen to actually feed the roots. If there's too much water, the oxygen gets pushed out and the plant's not going to survive. Too much water can also lead to rot. You can actually rot the roots by having too much water. So what's the magic answer? The problem is there isn't an easy answer. This is a daily activity where you're going to have to monitor the moisture level of your growing medium, typically a potting mix. And if it's beginning to dry out, think about watering. If it seems like it's already got plenty of water, don't add more water. And we'll talk more about that as we proceed as well, because it's one of those things that it's experience, of course, is the best teacher when we're talking about growing our seedlings. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to let it dry out a little bit, and it's okay to let it get too wet a little bit. It's the extremes that we're really trying to avoid. And so start your seeds, grow some seeds so you can develop that experience to have an idea of what works. Now, for me here in Colorado, it tends to be dry during the months when I'm starting my seeds and then growing my seedlings. And I can usually go down and add water every day. And I know that in a big flat, one of those flats that has 72 cells of plants growing in it, I can use about a quarter gallon to water a flat of new seedlings, the ones that have just emerged. As the seedlings begin growing, they're going to need more water. So after about a month, when we have active growth on those seedlings, I'll be using closer to half a gallon of water in a day, maybe slightly less. But again, the key is that I'm monitoring the level of the soil, the moisture level within the soil. And then from there, we'll see what it looks like as far as the plants. And the plants will tell you what's going on. Wilting is a common response. If it's too little water or too much water, the plant's going to wilt. And even a small seedling will begin to show signs of wilting. So get to know your plants, look closely at them, and get a feel for the moisture levels. Now, I like to water from below. So when I say I'm adding a quarter of a gallon of water to a whole tray, I'm not watering from the top. I'm actually pouring that into the tray, into the container that all of those cells are resting in. And because of the capillary action of that peat moss or cocoa coir, it's going to draw up the moisture from below. That helps keep the soil relatively consistent. If I go back tomorrow, the next day, and I pull up the tray or pull up some of the cells to water the tray, and I see that there is still water in that tray, I'll do one of two things. I'll definitely stop watering. I won't water any more that day because there's already some water in the tray. But now I'll check the moisture of the soil and potentially remove the standing water that's already in that tray. So I was talking with a gardener friend this last week about using a turkey baster. If you have a turkey baster, one of those bulb and syringe kind of looking kitchen gadgets, that's ideal for sucking out that excess moisture if you find that the plants haven't used it all. If there's standing water at the bottom of the tray, that's saying that that soil is saturated. It can't absorb any more. And it's probably a good idea to go ahead and get rid of some of that moisture at that time. Mountains and Mayhem is saying, I'm so excited to start seeds. I really want to, even though I know I have to wait until March. So yes, that's a big reason why we're talking about this today, because I'm going to be starting most of my seeds in March and April as well. But learning about it and thinking about those things that we need to consider will get us ready for the March timeframe. And like we talked about previously, some seeds may need a very early start. And so a lot of gardeners are already starting here in January or soon in February. So definitely a consideration for those kind of things when you're going to be doing your seeds. Kimmy ML is saying, just started seeds yesterday. Good for you. I'm a little envious. There are some seeds that I was planning on starting, some herb seeds, but I think I'm going to wait another week for that. And then we can start talking more as my plants are growing bigger and taller, and yours as well. And so what allows our plants to grow taller? And so there's an important distinction. We want robust, sturdy seedlings that will grow tall to an appropriate height for the age of that seedling. What we don't want is a tall, thin, leggy plant. Tall, thin, leggy is the plant telling us it's not getting enough light. So we've got the water situation figured out. Now the light situation becomes critical, because if the plant doesn't have enough light, it's going to search for more light, or it's going to reach towards the light source that it does have. And if it's not enough, it's going to grow very quickly to reach that little bit of light. That's what causes those thin, leggy stems on a plant. So we need adequate light. We need strong light. A big problem that most gardeners encounter at some point is you've got lights, you've got grow lights, you've got your LED lights, maybe they're fluorescent lights, and you set them over the plants. They need to be close to the plants. We're talking just a few inches. Most of the grow lights that you're going to be using for seed starting should be about 3 or 4 inches above the plants. That's all. We're talking very, very close. If you're using a light that generates heat, so if you're still using incandescent bulbs, or if you're using one of those really strong grow lamps that might be sodium based, for instance, they can generate a lot of heat. So those lights in particular do need to be well above the plant or they'll burn the plant, but they're also producing a lot of light. It's mainly the fluorescent and the LED lights that need to be very close to the plants because they're just not as strong. And that's going to help you get that strong, robust plant. As the plant grows, you raise your lights. So you're going to start with the light 3 or 4 inches above those emerging seedlings. And then you're going to gradually raise the light. By the time the plants get to close to full size, the light may be 5, 6, maybe 12 inches away from the plant by that point. But in the beginning, you need light and you need a good amount of light as far as the time. Aim for 14 to 16 hours a day that those young seedlings are going to get light. So the light needs to be close and strong, and it needs to be long. You won't gain anything with a 24-hour light. In fact, seedlings do need some rest period. So 14 to 16 hours, a few inches above the plant, and by then you should actually be fine. It's the kind of thing that look at the plant. If it seems green, dark green is what most plants are when they're in the seedling stage. If it isn't thin and leggy, then you're probably doing things okay. I just put my lights on a timer and they come on in the morning and they go off in the evening. And during the course of the day, I go down and check on them and the lights are already on. So that just makes it really easy. One of the things when we talk about the seeds and seedlings, and there's differing options, and some gardeners do it one way, and some gardeners do it another way, is when you actually start using the lights. Now, most seeds do not require light to germinate, but almost all seedlings need full light to continue growing. The warmth is a factor, the moisture is a factor, and we can have a basic idea of how long it's going to take for our seeds to germinate based on what the seed packet says or what the website says about that particular plant. So if you're starting seeds and you're expecting germination to take 5 or 6 days, then you don't need a light on those seeds. The light's really not going to benefit those seeds at all. But at the 5-day point, the lights definitely need to be on. I pretty much just leave my lights on. I get them set up. I have the timer. When I start my seeds, I just go ahead and put them underneath the light. That way, if they germinate at 3 days, they've already got light. If I was expecting 5 and I wasn't going to turn the lights on until 5, but the plants emerge on day 3, that means they've got to grow for a couple of days without light, and they're going to be searching for it, and they're going to get leggy. So I just turn the lights on for a few extra days, and I've never had an issue with the plants growing at that point. So up to you if you want to wait until they actually germinate, or if you want to get ahead of the game and have the lights ready for whatever time they germinate. We've got the water in our mix. So when you sow your seeds, you should be sowing them in a moist mix. A big way to avoid the overwatering and the underwatering is to start with that moist mix and then to cover the seeds with some type of plastic or glass that's going to retain that moisture. So even if you're using a heat pad, which is going to cause evaporation, if you have a dome over your tray, a humidity dome. So if you're buying like a Jiffy tray and it's got all those plant cells in it, most of them come with that clear plastic cover. Use that. Use that in the early days of your seedling growth, because for that first phase, for the first week, maybe even for the first 2 weeks, you don't have to worry about watering. As long as you start with that moist mix and as long as you've got that humidity dome, the moisture is not going to be lost. So you'll have a pretty consistent level of moisture as those seedlings are growing. If you don't have a big tray like that, if you're just starting your seeds in a small pot, you can do the same thing. Just cover it with a plastic bag to do the same thing so that the plastic bag holds in that moisture to maintain that consistency, that nice humid environment that that young seedling is really going to need to start its growth cycle. Mobius 981 says, I have those little 12 cell boxes with domes and LED lights. Pretty cute. Sounds like a nice setup. Humidity dome wide open. And so that's the next phase. So once you've got the seeds germinated, and then once those seedlings start growing, the humidity dome is not as important anymore. So you can open it and then close it. And I'll do that depending on how humid it is. So particularly if I'm using a heat mat, you're going to see condensation within the dome. So I will remove the dome and drain that water back into the cell and then leave it open for a while. Then at night, I'll generally close it again and start that cycle over again. Once you remove the humidity dome, you can just take it off completely. But when the plant is still very small, I'll still use the humidity dome just so I don't have to water as often, so that I avoid the possibility of over watering those young seedlings. By removing the humidity dome, that can actually help reduce some potential problems, some potential diseases. So one of the most common ways that you're going to kill your plant is by having too humid of an environment. So if you leave that humidity dome on and it stays on while the plant is growing and you don't introduce new air, that humid air is going to promote the growth of fungi. Different fungal strains are going to be in your potting mix. Damping off disease is a fungal disease, and it's caused by a number of different fungi. If you can take away that inviting environment for the fungus, you greatly reduce the possibility of damping off disease. Now, damping off disease is a fungus that attacks the stem. And it basically is like looking in a forest and you see all the trees are chopped down. That's kind of what the fungus does. It basically causes the seedling to just fall over because the stem has been attacked by the fungus. Remove the humidity dome and you lessen the likelihood of that happening, because you're letting air in and you're making the fungus not as happy. Previously, we talked about one of those things, particularly with the bottom watering, that you would let the surface of the soil dry out. So you let your potting mix actually dry a bit on the surface. That reduces the fungal issues, it reduces fungus gnats, and it really helps promote the growth of those young seedlings. So definitely some things that you want to pay attention to if you've had a problem with damping off disease before. And most of us have at some point had that problem. But by understanding when to use the humidity dome and when to remove the humidity dome, that can greatly reduce the likelihood of that happening. Serena's saying, what if you still have 37 more cells waiting to germinate when 2 have germinated and are touching the top of the dome? I have 2 sweet candy onion plants doing this. Cut and keep. So It's a good question. First off, if you can plan ahead of time, go ahead and plan the seeds that you're putting into a single tray to have similar germination times. And so to use a single tray with a seed that's only going to take 3 days to germinate, and then to have other seeds that are going to take 2 weeks to germinate, you're going to run into this problem. Some of the seeds are going to be germinating and growing long before the other seeds have even germinated. You don't want to hamper the growth of your plants. So generally, as soon as those seedlings start growing and they begin to reach the top of your humidity dome, remove the humidity dome and don't use it anymore. You don't want to have the plants growing into that obstruction. It is probably going to require you to do some individual watering. And so this is a case where you might want to get a spray bottle and just mist those cells that have yet to germinate, because they will benefit from a consistently moist soil to germinate, whereas the plants that are already actively growing will benefit from a slightly dry surface. So within the same tray, yes, you're going to be watering differently because you've got plants growing at different stages of their life. If you can, avoid that from the beginning by matching the seeds that you have growing within the cells, and then you can just do everything pretty consistently without too much worry. Now, the nice thing about onions, we touched on this with a question last week or the week before about whether we should trim our onions. And so if onions are growing faster than everything else and you're using a dome, you can trim off the tips of onions. It's not something that I do, but onions are one of those plants that a lot of people actually do trim. And trimming it a little bit early is not really going to cause too much problems. But I would just go ahead and remove the dome and then water accordingly. And that way you should reduce some of the problems. Now, what do I do about the nutrient levels within my mixes? I like to start my seeds in a seed starter mix. Now, the seed starter mix essentially has no nutrients. When you're talking peat moss and cocoa coir as the primary ingredient in a seed starter mix, there's no nutrients in either one that are really going to benefit our young seedlings. So when we start in a seed starter mix that essentially has no nutrients, that's fine for the beginning phase of the seedling, the point where it's just the cotyledon leaves, those first leaves that have developed. Remember, everything the seed needs to grow those young seedlings is contained within the seed. It's when the plant starts getting a little bit bigger, when the true leaves begin growing. So if you haven't done this before, if you're new to starting seeds, you'll see that the plant actually has different types of leaves. The cotyledon leaves typically are rounder and they all look the same. It's hard to tell one seedling from another by looking at those first leaves because most cotyledon leaves are relatively identical. They all have the same basic shape. It's that next set of leaves, the true leaves, that will give you an indication what type of plant it is, and also give you an indication that the plant needs nutrients to continue growing. So when I start my seeds in a seed starter mix and the seedlings begin growing, I'm looking for that first set of true leaves. So it'll be 2 sets of leaves, the round leaves and then the regular leaves. So a tomato plant, that first set of true leaves are going to look like tomato leaves. And on a pepper plant, they're going to look like pepper leaves. And that's just the way it works with all the different plants. So when we start getting those true leaves, now you need to think about transplanting into a potting mix. And the potting mix needs to have the nutrients. You can start directly in a potting mix. You can put your seeds in the potting mix and you don't have to worry about the transplanting stage. The potting mix should contain those macronutrients that the plants are going to need. When you buy a potting mix, look at the bag and you'll notice that almost all of them, all of the big name brands, have fertilizer in them. They've got nitrogen, they've got phosphorus, they've got potassium at very low levels, but at the levels that are enough for those young seedlings to use. I use compost in my mixes. A lot of commercial mixes will also use compost. Compost is going to provide some of the nutrients that the plants need in addition to the fertilizer. So my mixes will contain compost and fertilizer so that when those seedlings start growing, the nutrients are there. But it's going to be less than you typically will use for plants. Commonly, we will have a half strength fertilizer. So if you look at the fertilizer and it says to put 2 tablespoons in a gallon of water and water your plants with that, try putting 1 tablespoon in a gallon of water and then watering your young seedlings with that. Too much of a good thing is a bad thing when it comes to the seedlings. And the fertilizer can actually be too strong. You'll talk about burning the roots. That's a common term that gardeners will use. That just means usually nitrogen, but it's too strong for those young plants to be able to recover from when they're exposed to a strong fertilizer mix. So weak fertilizer, if you're going to use a liquid fertilizer, I prefer to go ahead and put all of that into my potting mix. So do I fertilize my seedlings? No, I don't. Everything that my plants need is within the potting mix. And if you're using one of those commercial mixes that has the fertilizer in it, that's all they're going to need as well. You don't need to add a liquid fertilizer as the seedling continues to grow. And by adding liquid fertilizer, you could be doing more harm, and it could be one of those reasons why your seedlings end up dying. Shandy's Garden, hello. It's asking, how much of a difference is there between using perlite or vermiculite on the surface of your seed tray? I've tried both, and I don't see much advantage other than surface sow seed. And so the difference between perlite and vermiculite. Perlite essentially retains no moisture. So if you're using perlite, any moisture is going to drain right through it. Vermiculite will retain some moisture. So when you use vermiculite, particularly on the surface, it is going to hold some of that moisture. And that's really the key difference. The benefits of using vermiculite, and I'll use vermiculite for some of my plants. It helps reduce the likelihood of damping off disease. It reduces the likelihood of fungus gnats, and it also helps stabilize the moisture level of the soil because the surface is mostly dry, but particularly with the vermiculite, it does retain some of the moisture on the surface so that it doesn't dry out completely. It's a technique. There's no requirement to use it. It can be used if you want to try to sow seeds. And I think this is what you're probably talking about. So if you're sowing seeds and it says lightly cover with soil or sow at a depth of 1/4 inch, what you can do is you can actually sow that seed on the surface of your potting mix. And then you cover it with a light layer of vermiculite or with 1/4 inch of vermiculite. And that essentially covers the seed so that it can germinate and begin growing. The advantage, I haven't really noticed much difference between how the plant grows, whether I use vermiculite or whether I cover it with the potting mix. It really isn't much difference. But that's because I'm really focused on trying to maintain the proper moisture level. If you're not that consistent with how much you check on your plants and you check on the moisture within the soil, vermiculite is kind of a backup. It does help a little bit where you don't have to water as often, and it does help maintain a little more consistency within the moisture level within that potting mix. Now, the container can be important that you're going to use when you're starting your seedlings. So when I'm using a seed starter mix for my seedlings, I'm just using those small cells. So in that tray that's got 72 cells, each of those cells is big enough for one plant, maybe two plants, before I then move to the transplanting stage. I don't need a big pot to germinate plants and begin that initial seedling growth. You can start in a bigger pot. You don't have to go through all these stages of transplanting to a bigger pot. You can just go ahead and start in the bigger pot to start with, or choose one of those trays like we were just talking about in the question a few minutes back. Instead of doing a 72 cell tray, try a 36 cell tray, or maybe a 6 cell tray. When you've got the same size tray, but you've got fewer pots, that means each of those pots is a bigger pot, and you can grow more plants in it. This is a big difference that I noticed between the way that gardeners in the UK tend to grow and gardeners in the US tend to grow. When you watch Monty Don, for instance, in the UK, and he'll be starting seeds in a small pot, he'll start multiple seeds in the same tray or in the same pot, and then prick out those little seedlings and transplant them into another pot. I and most of my friends tend to start in a very small pot with an individual plant in it, and then just pull out that whole plant and put it into another pot. The key difference is how you lift the plant. So when you're growing in an individual cell, you are able to lift out that entire mass of the soil mix and the roots and the plant and transplant it into another pot. When you're growing multiple plants in a pot, now you have to dig out the plant, trying to include as many roots as possible, including some of that soil in the pot, and then you spoon that into your bigger pot. There does tend to be more likelihood of root damage when you've got multiple plants growing in a container, and then you have to dig them out and move them to a bigger pot. Nothing wrong with that. That's another one of those experienced teachers, and you'll see that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you damage the roots. Sometimes you actually drop the plant on the table, which may break the plant, definitely damage some of the roots. But these are a couple different ways that you can try and maybe learn something along the way. That's one reason why I like to do the individual cells, because I find them much easier to just pry out and plop into a bigger pot. And it actually tends to work pretty well. So give a shout out to Eli and Kate. Saw that Eli has joined us. Always nice to have you here. And be sure and throw out your questions. I know I'm doing a lot of talking today, but that's because I haven't seen a lot of questions come by. So looking for your questions. So we've covered those big things. We've talked about the moisture. We've talked about oxygen as far as not drowning the plants. We've talked about the heat factor. We've talked about the light. We've talked about the nutrients. And then we've just started touching here on those containers that you're going to use. None of it has a single answer for all of us. You can use whatever lights you want. I have fluorescent lights and I've got LED lights. You can use whatever container you want. I like those 72 cell trays, but I also use yogurt cups a lot to grow my plants, or I'll use those big red solo cups. I do that a lot. There's a new system that I'm starting to use now from Greenstock. Greenstock has some seed starter trays, and they're a little bit bigger. Remember, I talked about how you can adjust the size of the cell that you're using. Well, the Greenstock ones are bigger than the smaller ones I was using. So it doesn't require that second stage of transplanting. So the Greenstock seed starters, I can start in and never have to worry about transplanting until I just take the whole thing out to my Greenstock. And what's so cool about it is the Greenstock has 6 pockets in each of the tiers. Well, makes perfect sense. The seed starters that the Greenstock system has is made up of 6 cells. So you can plan what you're going to be growing in each layer of your Greenstock, grow it in those 6, and then you just carry the 6 out and plop those into Greenstock when it's time to transplant. So very easy. Now, when I use that kind of system, when I'm not doing that intermittent transplanting, I like to still use seed starter mix on the surface for the seed to germinate and begin growing. But the rest of the pot has that potting mix with the nutrients in it, with that fertilizer and compost that's already part of the mix. So when you're using some of those bigger containers, depending on the size of the container, we only need about a 1/4 inch, maybe 1/2 inch of seed starter mix, that nutrient poor material. All that does is just allow those roots to really get a good head start on the growth and then dig into the potting mix. So for a starter pot, let's say it's 3 inches high, we only need the top 1/2 inch to be seed starter mix, and then the bottom 2.5 inches is the potting soil that we're going to be using. And so when you use something like that, that's a little bit bigger, you don't have to worry about transplanting. You don't have to worry about the root damage. And everything that the seedling is going to need is already contained in that small container. So all you have to do is just take it out to your garden to transplant, take it out to your containers, take it out to your green stock. Definitely makes the whole process much easier. Christine Peters is asking, have you ever purchased from Mountain Valley Seed Company? I just ordered some seeds from them. The seed packs have a beautiful cover and lots of information on the back. I don't think I have. I think this was one of those companies that we had talked about a few weeks ago. And so that's good to know. I love, as those of you who watch regularly know, I love seed packets that have all that information on them. So thank you for that suggestion. I'm not aware that I've used them. There's a whole bunch of companies I've used over the years, and maybe that I have forgotten about because I tend to focus on a few handful of companies that I do most of my ordering from. But Mountain Valley Seed Company, I'll look at them when we're done here and see if they got a catalog, and take a look at what they're offering with their seed packets. That's a great suggestion. Eli and Kate has a question. What is your preferred playlist music you listen to when you're working on your seed sowing and growing? That's a great question. So it depends. So if I'm doing a whole lot of seeds, and so they're during the peak of the season when I'm starting 150 at a time. So I'm using the 72 cell trays, and I'll be doing 2 trays, and then I'll take a break, and then maybe I'll do 2 more trays. And so I'll do 150 seeds, take a break, come back and do another 150. So that takes some time. And I'll often listen to a podcast during that time, and lots of different podcasts that I listen to. But most of the time, when I'm not doing so many all at once, when I'm just doing general seed starting, I'll listen to music, and I'll have different playlists. And so I do Pandora for the most part, and it depends on what kind of mood I'm in for the day. And I do tend to listen to music from my era. So I'll listen to the Eagles channel. I might listen to the Beatles channel. But believe it or not, uh, I usually do this when I'm sowing seeds outside and I'm in the sun and it's feeling good. I'll listen to like the Irish Pogues, and so I'll have my Irish music that'll be playing during those days. So a lot of it depends on what I'm feeling, whether it's inside or outside, and lots of different types of music, of course, that go beyond just those. Tom Petty, listen to a lot of Tom Petty. So there you have it. Those are some of the ones I listen to, but I'll also listen to some newer stuff as well. So I got to stay up with what my granddaughters are listening to, and and it's one of those things that I don't listen to crazy new music, but relatively easy listening kind of new music, and it helps with the whole seed process because I'm focused on what I'm doing. The music is more of just a background of what's happening. I'm not listening for the words or for the message. It's just something to occupy the back side of my brain, which is why I can listen to almost anything, including Taylor Swift. I'll listen to Taylor Swift so that when my granddaughters come over, I can put on the Taylor Swift channel, and they think I'm a pretty cool grandpa for doing that. So one of those little tips, if you've got grandkids that are coming to your garden, is play Taylor Swift, because chances are they're probably listening to Taylor Swift. And yeah, here's another one. DLR 978 is saying, the Beach Boys. I play music for my plants. The Beach Boys Smile album, lots of songs about outdoors and vegetables, or the music King Charles commissioned for his garden. Cool. Yeah, I actually will listen to the Beach Boys as well. Beach Boys, I think that absolutely. One of the very first albums I ever bought many, many years ago was the Beach Boys. And so, yeah, they're definitely on my playlist as well. But I don't know King Charles music. So I think I may have to look up to see what kind of music King Charles commissioned, because that's kind of a nice idea to listen to something that was actually specifically developed for that. Jen Van Brunt is saying another seed company I don't think we mentioned in the previous live stream is So True Seeds out of Asheville, North Carolina. Their community was very affected by the hurricanes last year. Yeah, absolutely. I love So True Seeds. I support them. And in fact, they're one of the companies that I've partnered with. So if you use Gardner Scott as a code for all kinds of different seed companies. So So True Seed is one of them. And you use the Gardner Scott code at checkout, there's a discount for a whole bunch of different seed companies that I've coordinated the discount for. And So True Seed is one that I do like and that I have got seeds before. So thank you for that. Yeah, I'm not sure if we did mention them or not, but it is something to think about. Shiloh is saying, you mean you don't listen to death metal? No, I actually don't. Occasionally I'll come across a song that I'm exposed to someplace else and I may like it, but not in the garden. I'm not a death metal kind of guy when it comes to the gardeners. So that's pretty funny. And I'm just Stardust says, I like to listen to country music because they often sing about beans. And it's just a weird feeling to sow beans while listening to music talking about beans. That's cool. Yeah, I listen to a lot of country music as well. I almost always try to choose a different playlist for each day I'm going out, and then I'll repeat it occasionally. But yeah, there's a lot of country music, newer, and older. And so for me, older, I listened to a lot of country music in the 90s. And so when I'm listening to what for me is old country music, it's a lot of music like Joe Diffie and Shania Twain. Those are a lot of the things I'm listening to. But I do listen to a lot of the newer stuff as well. So that's interesting to see some of these suggestions that people are throwing out. And Bob Marley, Lenny Kravitz, Jimi Hendrix, Yeah, they're on my playlist as well. So that's awesome. Mountains and Mayhem says my usual thing to listen to is YouTube videos or podcasts. Yeah, that's a good suggestion too. Now I just started. I haven't talked about this, and so you can expect that today's episode will be part of it as well. But I have started a Gardner Scott podcast on YouTube. So when you go to your YouTube, you'll see the option to play shorts, to play videos, to play to play playlists, and you should also see podcasts because YouTube is starting to do podcasts. And so what I've done is to actually take some of these live streams that I think are good ones that have good information, because I know a lot of you do listen to YouTube videos. And so you can actually go to the Gardner Scott homepage on YouTube and click on the podcast and see the episodes that I have lined up. I'll be starting a separate podcast with some other of my videos, and I'll also be making some newer ones specifically for the podcast. And you can listen to me and many others through YouTube in the garden now. So yeah, that's a great option. We often think of the big podcast companies that we see on our phone, but believe it or not, YouTube has more podcasts than any other platform. So you can now find Gardner Scott on the podcast within the YouTube world and listen in the garden as well. If you're one of those that is already listening to these live streams in your garden, it's right up your alley, because that's the basic idea for others to start doing the same thing. So great idea. Absolutely great idea. There's Jay with the link to the So True seed with the code for Gardner Scott. And so Botanical Interest is another company I've got the partnership with. You can use the Gardner Scott code, Survival Garden Seeds. You can use the Gardner Scott code. There's a few of them. Most of them I have linked in the description below. So if you're ever wondering, go ahead and just type in Gardner Scott whenever you're buying anything that's garden related, and who knows, you may get a discount. You know, one of the ones that reached out to me, and now I have a code with, is Greenhouse Megastore. So when we're talking about all of the seed starting and all these pots and all these trays and the humidity domes and the perlite and the vermiculite, I get all of that through the link that I have below, the Greenhouse Megastore. And if you use the Gardner Scott code, you can get a discount. So that's what I do, and I've been using them for years. And when I'm putting my mixes together and when I'm doing all of this seed and seedling growing, a lot of those materials come from the Greenhouse Megastore. I did a video a couple of years ago where I showed my setup, and I've got hundreds of pots and dozens of trays. They all came from Greenhouse Megastore. So if you're getting serious about this, consider them as a source for all of your pots and all of your materials. And they've got good prices when you buy in bulk like that. And it really does make a difference. Big Will Dog has a question on the topic of relaxing while gardening. What's your preferred drink of choice? Mine is a cold brew when it's warm. So generally, so while I'm gardening and I'm in that planting, sowing, general care mode, it's just water. I'll take water out. If I'm going to be out there during the day and I'm taking a break underneath my wonderful covers in the middle of the garden, my gazebo with the sitting area that is in the background of a lot of my videos, I'll usually do iced tea, unsweetened iced tea. And then later in the day, when I'm relaxing in the garden and I'm not actively doing a gardening related activity, it depends on the time of year, depends on whether I'm alone or not. And so, yeah, a cold brew is often really nice on those hot afternoons. But in early evening, it might actually be a Scotch whiskey or a cocktail of some type. I like to do that when I have friends come over. So different drinks for different times of day, for different situations, whether it's me alone. I typically don't drink alcohol by myself. I usually save that when I'm socializing with someone else. But water and tea are usually my go-to for most of those kind of things. Serena's asking, someone sent me lima bean seeds. Do you grow them? When can they be started if the last frost date is April 15th? Zone 7A. So zone doesn't matter. It's all about that last frost date. And so lima beans, this last year, I did grow some small lima beans and some large lima beans. And I show a little bit about that in my 15 bean soup video. And that's the first time I've grown lima beans in years. I'm not a big fan of lima beans, so I don't normally grow lima beans. Lima beans like warm temperatures. And so generally you're going to be sowing them outdoors after your last frost date. And so look at the seed packet, look at the information online. Chances are it's going to say either sow directly outdoors after all danger of frost, or it'll say sow outdoors 1 or 2 weeks after your last frost date. So general guidelines for when you would be starting lima beans outside. And of course, the temperature of the air and the temperature of the soil are important factors when deciding to grow any seeds, but particularly bean seeds. Now, some bean seeds can handle some cooler soil, but those bigger seeds, like the lima beans, they take longer to grow. They're going to grow better if you can put them into warm soil. That's absolutely an approach to take. And that's the approach I take when I'm growing most of my beans. Okay, and so, yeah, it looks like Eli's talking about their chill utery. And so that's, you can watch some of Eli and Kate's videos. They have a space in their garden. And you know, this is a big part of my gardening philosophy. You should have an area in your garden to sit and just soak up all that wonderful garden energy. If you want to throw in that adult beverage, more power to you. And that's what their chill utery is all about. It's a couple seats they have in their garden where they can just sit back and chill and enjoy all the work they've done and enjoy being together in their garden. So I love that idea. And I think it's a fantastic word that they use to describe that, just that whole concept. Specifically for them, it's an area within the garden. Absolutely love that. Absolutely. So go for it. St. Shandy's Garden says the best medicine for the garden is the gardener. I like that. And I would go on to say the best medicine for the gardener is the garden. So it works both ways. That's one real, it's been so cold here in Colorado. Everything is still covered with snow. The high yesterday, I think, I don't know, it might have got up to 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -8 Celsius. It's just been cold. It's supposed to actually warm up closer to normal over the course of this next week, which means it's going to be slightly above freezing during the day, and it's going to be well below freezing at night. I'm still getting out every day and walking through my garden. The dogs love it. They go crazy every time we all go out together, especially this time of year, because I'm not out a lot, but I do go out every day to just walk through the garden. Even if it's snow covered, even if it's snowing, even if it's cold and the wind is blowing, I need that time in my garden for my own benefits, mental, physical, philosophical. I think just spending time in the garden is important. And as I've said many times in the past, it's the basic tenet that kind of ties in with this previous comment. A good garden grows where a good gardener goes. And so the best thing you can do for your garden is just to be in your garden. You'll notice things that you wouldn't notice if you weren't in your garden. And when we're talking about seeds and seedlings, whether you're growing them indoors, and most of this focus is on the indoor growing, but it also all holds true for outdoor sowing as well. It's the same idea to recognize whether you have damping off disease or whether you have the fungus gnats or whether you've got mold that might be growing on the surface because it's just too wet. Those are things to look for. If you use peat moss, and one of the reasons I like using peat moss, now here in the United States, we get our peat moss from Canada, and they practice sustainable farming as much as possible. I know most of the world has actually begun to outlaw peat moss because it's not sustainable. But here in the United States, we use it. It's very affordable. It's common in virtually all potting mixes. And you'll see algae growing on the surface if it's too wet. If you're using a peat moss based potting mix and the top is green, that's an indication that maybe your potting mix is too wet. And I like that. That's one of those colors that is in nature and shouldn't necessarily be on the surface of our potting mix. So if you see something like algae growing, it's not going to kill your plant, but it is an indicator that it's probably too wet. But by looking at your plants, you can see that damping off is hit, and you might be able to catch it early. If you notice just a few of your young seedlings have looked like they've been chopped down, now you can stop watering, take a fan, blow it across the surface to dry out the surface a little bit more, and you might be able to save some of your other seedlings from being killed by the damping off disease. You got to be looking at your plants. You got to be paying attention to them to see those kinds of things happen. The growth of your plant should be relatively consistent. You go out or go down, go wherever your seedlings are growing, and every day they should be a little bit bigger. If suddenly, overnight, they shoot up to the sky and they start looking leggy, long, and spindly, they're telling you you need more light. So that is an indicator to lower your lights or get brighter lights. You wouldn't know that unless you're checking on them every single day. So yes, the best medicine for your garden is just to be in your garden. And even if your garden is nothing more than a couple pots in your basement, you still need to follow the same basic guidance. And it really can make a big difference when it comes to the success of whether your seedlings are going to survive or not. I have my water mister on hand all the time. Beyond those first few days, I really don't use it much unless I get in that situation where it's the opposite of too moist. Maybe I forgot a day and the plants look like they're beginning to suffer. I'll mist the plants, I'll mist the surface, and then I'll water from beneath so that I get an immediate infusion of water. And then I'll check again the same day to see if I got that water pooling and if I need to take my turkey baster to suck up some of that moisture. So sometimes, like an emergency room, you need water stat, and you get there and just dump water on the plants because they're telling you that they're drying out. And most of the bigger plants in our garden, wilting is normal, and they'll recover from a wilt. Seedlings, you may not have that same result. If a young seedling begins to wilt, it may not recover, especially when it's just small with a few leaves on it. There's just not the strength within the plant to be able to recover. So that's why it becomes so important to stay on top of things. And if you're not around, you can set things up relatively automatically. You can have an automatic waterer. You know, I mentioned that I use my automatic lights, but do try to have a system set up whoever's helping you, make sure they understand what your system is. I've mentioned a few times, last year I took a trip. I was gone for about a week and a half. I came back and the lights that I had on a timer hadn't turned on. The power bar had shut down for whatever reason. They didn't get light for at least a week. And the house sitter I had that was watering, but didn't know enough about plants to recognize that the lights should be on. And so I ended up losing almost all of those plants because when I returned, I didn't have strong, robust, dark green plants. I had little spindly white plants that were horizontal on the surface of the tray, searching for the little bit of light that was coming from a back window. And they never recovered. That initial cellular damage was something they could not recover from. So when I got there and I turned the lights on, they gradually began growing vertically, but the stems never recovered to the point that they were of any use or that I could transplant them. So I lost them all. Sometimes that happens. And it's my own fault for not educating the person that I asked to help take care of the plants so that they knew what to do to be able to avoid that kind of problem. So be aware of that. If you've got helpers, make sure the helpers understand just exactly what it is they're supposed to be doing. And that way, when you come back from a trip, your plants aren't all dead. And it is something that you don't have to think about the story you're going to tell in the future like I do, because of course I want to tell the story to help all of you avoid some of those same issues. So what other questions you have? I appreciate everything that is going on in the comments and some more of the discussion about how to water and some of the fertilizers that we may or may not be using. When it comes to my indoor setup, for the most part, the mix I'm using and the water I'm using is centralized from within my house. So I'm seeing some suggestions about homemade mixes. Outside, I do a lot of that. I'll use my comfrey and my dandelions and my nettles, and I'll make a liquid fertilizer. I'll, of course, sow seeds directly in my beds outside. But indoors, particularly since we're in that consistently warm household warm environment, I don't want to introduce a problem. So I haven't had damping off disease in years and years and years and years. Part of the reason for that is because I'm using sterile mixes. I'm using mixes I make myself, but they're mixes that have been sterilized. They come in bags, and then I mix the compost, I mix the peat moss, I mix the cocoa coir, I mix all the ingredients that have come as an either inert or sterilized product that I then mix for my own use within the household. I don't use my compost from outside. I don't use any fertilizers that I've mixed outside. The likelihood of introducing fungal spores to your grow space increases if you're bringing something from outside. And so in the greenhouse, it's different. Yeah, I'll use some of that stuff in the greenhouse because it's exposed to the outside air. But indoors, I'm very careful about how I'm growing my plants and what I'm introducing my plants to. And I'll reuse potting mix outside. I don't reuse potting mix indoors. So every year for seed starting and for growing my seedlings, it's a brand new mix. Then when I put it outside, it gets incorporated into the beds wherever I transplant. Or if the plants have died along the way, I'll take that mix and use it as an amendment in my beds outside. And it works. It works for me. So I don't have the diseases and I don't have the issues. The fungus gnats may be brought in some of those commercial mixes. So that is a possibility that some of those eggs might be there, but it's a rare problem for me because I'm essentially segregating the inside grow space from the outside grow space. So consider those type of factors when you're growing as well to try to keep everything clean. Do I sterilize my pots every year? No, I don't, because I don't have a big problem. If a disease hits, if there's some issue that I think is related to the pots, then yeah, next year I would get rid of all the materials. I would sterilize my pots and start fresh. I clean the pots, but I don't sterilize them because I don't have a disease problem that I need to worry about. So those are some of the factors. If you can keep everything like a hospital, then you don't have to worry about some of those problems that might be occurring on a pretty regular basis outside. Bohemian Herbology is saying using sterile soil. Agreed. Such a valid point. Never again after getting gnats once. Learning journey. I always sterilize now. There you go. And so if you're reusing a mix, then yeah, pop it in the microwave, pour boiling water over it, sit it out in the sun for days underneath plastic to get that solarization to kill everything underneath it. Lots of different ways to sterilize your potting mix, but can definitely, as you see, lead to some potential problems. Masabi Gal saying, Gardner Scott, you use your worm castings in your potting or seed starting mixes. So yeah, I do. And my worm castings follow the same thing. My worms live indoors and are being fed with materials from my kitchen. So nothing is coming from the outside. I made the mistake when I first was doing worms of taking some dried leaves from outside and using those leaves as part of the bedding for my worms. Had a huge mite problem, and the mites were attacking the earthworms. Never again. So started all over again, cleaned everything up. It was a pain getting rid of all of it, but by keeping everything, to include my earthworms, separate from everything happening outside, then yes, I can use my worm castings in my own potting soil mixes because it's essentially a clean worm casting with indoor materials, and the worms are growing indoors, and never had an issue when I used the worm castings. And so talking earlier about the mixes I use and the fertilizers and the compost, yes, I use the worm castings in some of my mixes as well to provide some of that additional nutrient and also some of the beneficial bacteria that are within the worm castings as well. So I would not, if it was warm enough, I can't have worms outside in my cold winters. But if I had an outside worm bin, I would not bring those castings inside for my potting mix and indoor seed starting, because I don't know what might be introduced from an outside to inside transference. So those are just some of those things that I try to do the best I can and minimize the issues. Bowtie Life, nice to see you here today. I sterilize pots by leaving them out in the Florida sun all summer. That'll sterilize the best, right? Yeah, generally. Now, sure, there are some things that need longer time, but direct sun with the UV radiation is enough to kill most of the things that are going to be on our pots. And so, yeah, if you're sterilizing your pots in the sun and you've never had a problem after that, then it's probably working. If there were a serious disease like a virus that was attacking your plants, I would probably take extra measures to try to kill it off, to include heat and chlorine and hydrogen peroxide. There's lots of things to try to kill pathogens. But if everything seems to be working okay, then I would say, yeah, the Florida sun, as long as it's that direct sunlight, that's probably enough to take care of most of the things. And I do the same thing. After I've transplanted, I'll put my pots in my greenhouse for a few weeks or more. Actually, this last year, most of them were in there for a couple months. And then I'll take those inside, wash them off, and I'm I'm assuming that they're sterilized enough to keep going because I don't have any of those disease issues. Patrick, always nice to see you. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. Are you planning a one seed this year? If so, which one? So I always do the one seed. I think you're talking about the single seed challenge, and I've made a few videos about the single seed challenge in recent years. I will do that. I always like to choose at least a single seed that I do my best to learn from and really pay attention to. And I haven't decided yet. I haven't started my seeds yet. So when I start my seeds, then I'll get to the point where I plan a one seed or for the single seed challenge. And I'll probably post that on Instagram and also in the community post on YouTube to let y'all know what that happens to be. Last year it was a pepper. I think the year before it was either a squash or a tomato, I forget. But I think it's a good thing, and I've talked about this in those videos I've made about the single seed challenge, that we talk about the watering, and we talk about the heat, and we talk about the light, and we talk about the potential diseases, and we talk about all these things in our garden. And sometimes, particularly if you've got a lot of plants growing, it's relatively difficult to see some of those things because we've got a forest of plants. And to see what's happening with a single plant is often lost. We miss out for the forest. We don't see the tree. By choosing a seed, by choosing a single plant, or maybe a couple, we can focus our attention on that one plant and then see if everything's going right, if what we're doing is working, if the plant is responding the way we want the plant to respond. And Scott Head, who has the Black Gumbo channel and is kind of the creator of the single seed challenge, a couple of years ago, the seed he chose and the plant he grew died. That's ideal. I mean, sure, we want our plants to live, but if you're going to have a problem in your garden, think about how wonderful it is if it's one of those plants that you've done the extra study on, that you've done extra research, that you know more about, and then it dies. Now you can really focus on what went wrong so that it isn't repeated in the future. So those are some of the benefits of that one seed and really focusing on it. So not sure what I'm going to do this year, but I'll let you know when I do decide, because it is a fun exercise. And that way, you can follow along, and if I do more videos along the way as well, it can make a big difference. Lynn Potes is saying, I have peat moss on hand that has been in a bag outside and in the basement. Is it not sterile now? Can I sterilize in the oven? So if it's an open bag, then, and especially if it's been outside, then yeah, I would say it's no longer sterile. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just when you know it's sterile, then it kind of relieves some of those concerns. And yeah, you can sterilize it in the oven. The issue about using your oven, and the gardeners that use their oven to sterilize their soil usually only do it once, because when you bake your soil, or even if it's just peat moss, it permeates the air and you will smell it in your house for days. So absolutely, it's something that you can do. Just be aware that baking a lot of those things will linger in your house for a while. And that's why some gardeners will moisten the mix and then put it in the microwave. That works pretty well. Or you pour boiling water over it. That works pretty well. They won't necessarily kill everything if there is one of those viral diseases. But for most of the bacteria and most of the fungi, that is enough to eliminate the problem that might be there. If the fungus was growing in your peat moss and there are spores, that's another issue. It takes a lot more to kill a spore than it does to kill a fungus. And so that's where it gets back to looking at your plants and looking at your mix. And if you see that something's going wrong, that might tell you that maybe you need to do something different next time. And then hydrogen peroxide is another one of those things that a lot of gardeners will soak their seeds in hydrogen peroxide to kill the bacteria that might be growing on it. You could soak your peat moss in hydrogen peroxide as well. So lots of options if you're concerned. Now, honestly, I will store my peat moss in my shed. And then when it comes time to do seed starter mix, if I don't have a bag indoors, I'll use some from the bag outside. It's not open. It might be an opened bag, but I do close the bag after I've taken some peat moss out. I'm not worried about that. I've used the peat moss from a bag that was opened outside and not had any issues. So a lot of it has to do with, are you in an environment or a location where those problems are occurring in other areas of your garden? If you've got disease, if you got pathogens already in your garden, then definitely don't cross-contaminate with what's happening indoors. But if you're like most of us and we really don't have a problem, yeah, it's okay to take some of those things like peat moss that were outside and use them indoors, and then just keep your eye on things. Colorado Bird Nerd, nice to see you here on this wonderful Colorado Monday. And thank you so much for supporting the channel. Thank you so much. You are very welcome. I'm always quietly listening in the background and learning so much. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. It is my pleasure. And you know, I say this every week. I just love being here and I love you all being here. So thank you for saying that. And thank you for supporting the channel. It does mean so much. And that's why I keep doing so much talking, to try to get out as much information as possible. And, you know, keep throwing those questions out because we still have a little bit of time to be able to answer any questions that I'm trying to go through and not miss anything that was too important. Yeah, Bud says, put your soil in a large roaster and heat in the barbecue until 180 degrees Fahrenheit. Yeah, absolutely. That's about 82, 81, 82 Celsius. And that's important. So when I was talking about how difficult it is to kill the spores and about how it really gets pretty smelly, great suggestion. 180 degrees for a sustained period of time is enough to take care of those spores. And when you're doing it outside in the barbecue, you don't have the permeating aroma indoors. So thank you for that, Bud. Good tip. It's something I think everyone should heat up their potting soil in their oven once, just so they know what I'm talking about. Riverdale Gardens, so nice to have you here today. It says great live today. So glad it's my day off. I'm so glad you are here today as well. And so glad that you're having a day off to join us. And Frank said, can't have a live often now. Thanks, Gardener Scott. And you're very welcome, Frank. It's nice to have you all here. Dan Low Music, we love you, Gardener Scott. And of course, all the awesome people in the chat. Well, thank you. You guys are making me feel so good on this Monday, getting ready to move forward with the week. I do appreciate everything you guys are doing to support me and be part of the chat. Hannah Herb has a question. I need advice for working with clay in the garden. What would you do? I would add organic matter. Period. Clay, sand, whatever soil you have, if it is not a loam, and even if it is a loam, add organic matter to your soil and it's going to fix most of the issues. So the problem with clay soil is the particle size is so small that when you put all those particles together, there's no space for the oxygen. So when we talk about what a seed needs, it needs oxygen. And what a plant needs, it needs oxygen. It can't get that in clay soil. And then you throw in the water and the water pushes out any oxygen that was there. And that's why it can be so difficult to grow in clay. Solution, organic matter. So when you think about it, I used to teach classes on soil, and the example I would give, think about a grain of salt. So the table salt you use in your kitchen, 1 grain of table salt is the equivalent of a particle of clay. Now think of sandy soil, maybe the sand at the beach. A single particle of sand is equivalent to the size of a basketball or a soccer ball. That's the difference in the size. And so that very small particle, when you have all of them clumping together, it just doesn't work well for most plants. When you add organic matter, and we're talking compost primarily, but any of those natural organic materials that you would put into soil, manures, grass, crushed up leaves, worm castings, all of those organic materials that we would add to the soil as an amendment are going to be huge by comparison to the particle size of clay. And so by incorporating those bigger particles with all of those small clay particles, now means you're introducing air pockets, you're introducing oxygen, you're introducing spaces that can contain not only air, but also water. It takes time, and it could take years for the soil to be developed and improved to the point that you really don't need to worry about it anymore. But I would just take a bunch of compost and mix it with my clay soil and grow in that. And you will have much better results than if you're just growing in the clay by itself. And the same holds true with the sand. Thinking about all these big basketballs, if you threw all those big basketballs into a tub, think all that space between the basketballs. That's what happens in sandy soil. There's so much space that when you water, the water just goes through all those spaces and drains out. When you add organic matter, the organic matter fills the space between the sand particles to hold on some of that moisture and to hold the nutrients within the soil. So from a water retention perspective, organic matter is magic in whatever kind of soil you have. And then when you throw in something like compost that actually has nutrients within the compost, that is going to provide what the plants need to grow, in addition to more consistent watering and the moisture levels that the plants need. So that's what I would do. That's what I have done. Luckily, most of my gardening, well, luckily it's all relative. Most of my gardens have been in sandy soil. But here in Colorado Springs, you go from one side of town to the other, and it's sandy or it's clay. And I've worked with a lot of gardeners who have clay soil, and that's what we do, is we use compost, and within a year or two, it's like magic. And you can't even tell that clumpy, yucky clay even exists anymore. So big reason why I love raised beds is because you can contain it within the bed. You don't have to worry about amending your entire yard. You just amend your localized garden beds over a period of time. And especially if you're just beginning, I'll do it twice. I'll do it in spring and I'll do it in fall. And the next year I'll do it in spring and then I'll do it in fall. And then that third year, I'll do it just in fall. And then in the fourth year, I may not have to do it at all because there's ample nutrients and ample organic matter in the soil. So absolutely, absolutely great way to work and to improve the situation, because not many of us have that perfect loam that we don't have to worry about. Most of us have something that is closer to the end of the spectrum, either end, and we got to do something. And amending with organic matter is a great option and almost the solution for any issue that you're going to have. So hope that helps. The week ahead, luckily for most of us, is actually going to be warmer. And so If you're not already getting outside in your garden, I suggest that over the course of next week, get outside in your garden. Even if you still have snow on the ground, do it. Start getting into that mindset of what's going to happen outdoors. And then, like we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, in choosing your seeds, starting your seeds, it may be time. Look at your last frost date and determine what it is you want to grow and when you need to start it. And the time may be now or in the next couple weeks. So start thinking about what you need to do to get all of that going, and then also to keep that seedling growing. And we can talk about it in the weeks ahead, and you can report back on it. I'll give you a little bit of teaser. In the next few weeks, I'm going to be having different guests talking about different subjects and a lot of new faces that I think some of you aren't familiar with. So I'm looking forward to some of those conversations. I hope you're looking forward to those conversations as well. And it all begins in 2 weeks. Next week, got a big announcement. So I hope you're all here because I'm excited to tell you about it. Between now and then, get out there, get in your garden, and above all, enjoy it. I'm Gardener Scott. See you next Monday.